The Galactic Scholarly Consortium's Central Archive was a marvel of architectural and technological engineering. Suspended in the gravitational nexus of the Andromeda Triangulum junction, it was a crystalline structure that defied traditional understanding of space and matter. Trillions of data streams pulsed through its translucent walls, each carrying the accumulated knowledge of thousands of civilizations. Today, those walls hummed with a different energy. The Xenological Adaptation Challenge was more than just a competition. It was the most rigorous test of collective intelligence ever conceived. For 10,000 years, the consortium had used this challenge to evaluate emerging species, to determine their potential for galactic citizenship. Most species didn't just fail. They were utterly demolished by the challenge's complexity. Of the 50 teams selected this cycle, 49 represented civilizations that had spent millennia perfecting their evolutionary advantages. The Karzin, with their instantaneous telepathic networking. The Nexus 7, crystalline beings capable of processing quantum computations faster than most species could breathe. The Vornak, masters of genetic optimization who could redesign their biological structures mid-challenge. And then there was the human team. Aria Chen stood out like a deliberate mistake. Her team's selection had been the subject of heated debate among the consortium's senior researchers. Some argued it was a statistical anomaly. Others saw it as a diplomatic courtesy. A few whispered about a potential long-term experiment. No one expected them to survive the first round. The selection process itself was brutal. Candidates underwent psychological evaluations that would break most species, telepathic probes that could map the deepest recesses of consciousness, quantum-level stress tests that simulated multiple existential scenarios simultaneously. The Karzin representative, a being of pure thought energy, had personally overseen Aria's evaluation. Its multi-dimensional consciousness had expected to find nothing more than primitive neural patterns, the kind that typically collapsed under the first wave of cognitive pressure. Instead, it found something else entirely. Aria's mind wasn't just resilient. It was a living ecosystem of potential. Where most species had rigid thought structures, hers was fluid, adaptive. She didn't just respond to challenges, she transformed them. Her cognitive pathways seemed to dance, reconfiguring themselves in real time, finding connections that shouldn't mathematically exist. The other team members were equally unconventional. Kai Rodriguez, a systems designer with a background in ecological restoration. Dr. Imani Okik, a quantum physicist who had been kicked out of 3 research institutions for being too creative. Lena Wang, a computational linguist who spoke 14 languages and had developed 3 of her own. Marcus Green, a social dynamics expert who had previously worked as a conflict resolution mediator in some of Earth's most complex political environments. They looked like a mismatched group pulled from a university's most obscure departments. Their preparation for the challenge seemed almost comically inadequate. While other teams arrived with entire support structures, neural enhancement pods, quantum computing clusters, genetic optimization chambers, the human team showed up with laptops, notebooks, and an impossible amount of coffee. The consortium's senior researchers watched with a mixture of amusement and scientific curiosity. "They won't last the first hour," muttered arch-researcher Vexnar, a being so ancient its original biological form was nothing more than a historical footnote. Humans are still wrestling with planetary-level challenges. This is beyond their comprehension. But there was something in Aria's eyes, a spark that didn't match any predictive model in the consortium's extensive database. As the teams assembled in the central evaluation chamber, a space that could simulate infinite environmental and cognitive conditions, the tension was palpable. Holographic interfaces flickered to life. Quantum stabilization fields hummed. The very fabric of reality seemed to prepare itself for what was coming. 50 teams. 50 different approaches to intelligence. 50 civilizations, each convinced of their own superiority. And in the middle of it all, one human team that looked like they had accidentally wandered into the wrong conference. The first challenge was about to begin. Nobody, absolutely nobody, was prepared for what would happen next. The first challenge materialized around them like a living hologram, a complex diplomatic scenario that would have crushed lesser teams within moments. The simulation generated an intricate political landscape of a multi-species planetary network on the brink of total systemic collapse. 12 different civilizations, each with incompatible communication protocols, cultural taboos, and fundamental biological differences, were locked in a cascading crisis that threatened total annihilation. Most teams immediately began analyzing data streams, their computational matrices grinding against the scenario's complexity. The Vornak team deployed sophisticated genetic communication algorithms. The Nexus 7 crystalline intelligence began constructing probability matrices that would have impressed most galactic research institutions. Aria's team did something entirely different. "Stop," she said quietly, raising her hand. The holographic data streams froze. Kai Rodriguez looked confused. "We haven't even begun analyzing." "We're not going to analyze," Aria interrupted. "We're going to listen." The other teams watched in bewilderment as the human team seemed to do nothing. No computational models. No rapid-fire strategic discussions. Instead, Aria closed her eyes and asked a seemingly absurd question. "What's the story here?" Dr. Imani O'Keefe, the quantum physicist, caught on first. She began mapping the emotional resonances between the conflicting species, not their technological or political interfaces. Where others saw data points, she saw narrative threads, unresolved tensions, historical traumas, unspoken fears. Marcus Green started sketching something that looked like an impossibly complex mind map. But it wasn't a traditional strategic diagram. It was more like a living, breathing ecosystem of relationships, with connections that seemed to pulse and shift. Lena Wong, the linguistic expert, began translating not just the words, but the underlying communication patterns. She discovered something remarkable. Each species was using fundamentally different communication paradigms, creating mutual misunderstandings that had been compounding for generations. "It's not a political crisis," Aria announced suddenly. "It's a translation problem." The consortium observers leaned closer. The other teams looked mystified. The holographic scenario had been designed with fail-safes to prevent any single approach from quickly resolving the conflict. Generations of prior attempts had resulted in complete system failures. The most advanced AI models had spent centuries trying to crack this specific scenario, always falling short. Aria's team didn't try to solve the problem. They tried to understand its fundamental nature. Kai began reconstructing the environmental and historical contexts that had led to the current crisis, not as a linear historical analysis, but as an interconnected web of causalities. Dr. O'Keefe mapped the quantum entanglements of cultural memory. Marcus tracked the psychological feedback loops that had transformed minor disagreements into existential threats. "We need a bridge," Aria said suddenly. "Not a solution. A bridge." The Karzan telepathic representative, observing the human team, felt something unprecedented. Their approach defied every computational model in its vast consciousness. They weren't reducing the problem. They were expanding understanding. Lena began constructing a communication protocol that wasn't a translation, but a complete reimagining of interspecies dialogue. It wasn't about converting words, but about creating a shared space of meaning. 12 minutes into the challenge, where most teams were still calculating initial approach vectors, the human team had already begun reconstructing the entire communication framework. The consortium judges watched in stunned silence. Marcus Green's relationship map had transformed into something alive. It showed not just conflicts, but potential connections. Not just differences, but complementary strengths. Each species wasn't just a data point, but a living, breathing entity with its own complex narrative. "They're not solving the problem," whispered one of the senior researchers. "They're dissolving it." By the 20-minute mark, the holographic scenario began to shift. The 12 civilizations, which moments ago seemed locked in an impossible conflict, started showing signs of unprecedented communication. Not resolution, something more profound. understanding. The other teams were still running computational models. The human team was creating a new way of seeing. When the first evaluation phase concluded, something unprecedented happened. The scenario didn't just stabilize, it transformed. The 12 civilizations began a dialogue that no one had thought possible. Arya Chen looked up, a slight smile playing on her lips. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the solution isn't about winning. It's about creating a space where winning becomes irrelevant." The consortium judges exchanged looks of profound discomfort and even more profound fascination. The first challenge was complete, and nothing would be the same again. The adaptive intelligence test was legendary among galactic researchers. A neural maze that wasn't just a physical challenge, but a living, quantum-responsive entity designed to break cognitive patterns. Previous teams had been trapped for days, their most advanced computational strategies dissolving against the maze's impossible complexity. The maze didn't just test intelligence, it consumed it. Adaptive algorithms became labyrinths of their own confusion. Telepathic networks collapsed under the weight of recursive impossibilities. When the human team approached, the maze itself seemed to pause. "It's watching us," Dr. Imani O'Keefe murmured, her quantum physicist's intuition crackling with understanding. The maze wasn't just a test. It was a living system, collecting information with every interaction. Arya Chen stood at the entrance, her posture relaxed in a way that immediately set the consortium observers on edge. Where other teams arrived with neural enhancement suits, quantum pathfinding algorithms, and multidimensional mapping technologies, the human team carried something far more subversive: curiosity. "We're not going to solve the maze," Arya announced to her team. "We're going to play with it." The other teams looked horrified. The Vornak computational strategists were already spinning complex pathfinding algorithms. The Nexus 7 crystalline intelligence had deployed quantum entanglement sensors that could theoretically map infinite dimensional spaces. The human team started by doing something unprecedented. They began to interact with the maze as if it were a living entity. Kai Rodriguez, the systems designer, started sketching. Not mathematical models, but organic diagrams that looked more like ecological studies than navigational charts. He was mapping the maze's reactions, not its structure. "It responds," he said quietly. "Every time we approach, it's collecting information about us." Marcus Green began what could only be described as a conversation with the maze. Not with words, but with body language, with subtle shifts of attention and intention. Where others saw walls, he saw communication channels. Dr. O'Keefe approached the first neural barrier with a quantum physicist's perspective that defied traditional understanding. Instead of trying to break through, she began to understand the barrier's fundamental nature. Her approach wasn't about overcoming, it was about engaging. Lena Wong started mapping the maze's language, not its physical structure, but its communicative patterns. She realized the maze wasn't a test. It was a conversation. The consortium judges watched in absolute bewilderment. The maze began to change, not dramatically, but subtly. Walls that had been impenetrable for thousands of species began to show microscopic fluctuations. The human team wasn't solving the maze. They were negotiating with it. "We're not the first to enter," Arya said suddenly, "but we might be the first to truly see it." Each team member approached the challenge differently. Where Kai saw systems, Marcus saw relationships. Where Dr. O'Keefe saw quantum potentials, Lena saw linguistic patterns. And Arya, she saw the maze as a living, breathing entity with its own form of intelligence. 12 minutes into the challenge, the other teams were still constructing their initial approach vectors. The human team had already begun a dialogue with the maze itself. The Karzin telepathic representative felt something unprecedented. The human team wasn't just adapting to the maze. They were creating a collaborative space with it. Their intelligence wasn't a tool to be applied, but a living ecosystem of potential. Walls shifted, not because the humans were solving a puzzle, but because they were engaging in a profound act of mutual understanding. By the 20-minute mark, something extraordinary happened. The maze wasn't just allowing passage, it was evolving, responding, communicating. The other teams watched in stunned silence as the human team moved through impossible corridors that seemed to reshape themselves in response to their approach. Not through force, through conversation. "They're not solving the maze," whispered one of the senior researchers. "They're collaborating with it." When the challenge concluded, the maze looked fundamentally different. It wasn't just navigated, it had been transformed. The other teams had static recordings of their attempts. The human team had created a living document of interaction. Arya looked up, a subtle smile playing on her lips. "Intelligence," she said softly, "isn't about finding the right path. It's about creating new possibilities." The consortium judges exchanged looks of profound discomfort and even more profound fascination. The adaptive intelligence test was complete, and the definition of intelligence itself had just been rewritten. The cultural translation challenge was designed to be linguistically impossible. 12 narrative fragments arrived, each from a civilization so fundamentally alien that previous attempts at translation had resulted in psychological trauma, complete communication breakdown, or total system failure. The challenge wasn't just about converting words. It was about preserving the essence of experience across impossible biological, cognitive, and dimensional boundaries. Previous teams had used advanced quantum translation matrices, telepathic resonance fields, computational models that could simulate entire civilizational consciousness patterns. The human team used something far more dangerous: imagination. Lina Wang spread the narrative fragments across their workspace. Where other teams saw incomprehensible data streams, she saw living stories waiting to breathe. "These aren't just communications," she murmured. "These are memories, experiences, entire universes of meaning." The first fragment came from the Churl, a civilization of energy beings that existed in 17-dimensional consciousness. Their language was less about words and more about quantum emotional states that shifted faster than light. Previous translation attempts had driven linguistic experts into permanent neural shutdown. Kai Rodriguez began mapping the fragment's structural patterns, but he wasn't looking for a linear translation. He was creating an ecological model of meaning, showing how each quantum emotional state connected to others, how experiences intertwined like complex root systems. Dr. Imani Okik approached the Churl fragment from a quantum perspective that defied traditional linguistic models. She didn't just analyze the language. She entered into a kind of sympathetic resonance with its underlying mathematical structures. Marcus Green did something entirely unexpected. He began to move, not randomly, but with a series of gestures that seemed to echo the fragment's internal rhythms. His body became a living translation matrix, interpreting the Churl experience through pure kinesthetic understanding. Arya watched, her mind creating connections that no computational model could predict. The consortium observers were bewildered. Translation wasn't just about converting meaning. For the human team, it was about creating a bridge of understanding so profound it transformed both the source and the receiver. The second fragment came from the Vexneri, a collective consciousness that communicated through intricate biochemical memory patterns. Previous translation attempts had resulted in entire research teams being psychologically fractured. Lina began to sing. It wasn't a song in any traditional sense. It was a living translation, a vocalization that captured the fragment's emotional landscape, its historical tensions, its unspoken memories. Her voice became a living translation matrix, transforming biochemical memories into a form of auditory poetry that seemed to bypass linguistic barriers. The Karzin telepathic observer felt something unprecedented. The humans weren't just translating. They were creating a new form of communication that existed between translation and pure experience. By the 20-minute mark, most teams were still constructing initial translation matrices. The human team had already begun to reimagine what translation could mean. The third fragment defied all previous understanding. It came from the Kithax, a civilization that experienced time as a tactile, three-dimensional substance. Their language was a complex choreography of temporal perception that had driven previous translators to madness. Dr. O'Keefe approached it with a quantum physicist's radical empathy. She didn't try to understand the language. She became a living translation, her consciousness momentarily aligning with the Kethax's temporal perception. Marcus began to move again, but this time, his movements described time as a physical space. Each gesture was a translation, each step a linguistic bridge between incomprehensible consciousness states. Arya watched the entire process, her mind creating connections that seemed to exist in the spaces between understanding. When the translation phase concluded, something extraordinary happened. The consortium's most advanced translation matrices began to recalibrate. The fragments weren't just translated, they had been transformed into living, breathing experiences that maintained their original complexity while becoming accessible. The other teams had static translations. The human team had created living bridges between consciousness. Translation, Lena said softly, isn't about converting meaning. It's about creating a space where meaning can exist. The consortium judges exchanged looks of profound discomfort and even more profound fascination. The cultural translation challenge was complete, and the very nature of communication had just been reimagined. The systemic collapse simulation was the most dreaded challenge in the Galactic Scholarly Consortium's history. A planet-wide scenario of total societal breakdown. 18 different interconnected systems collapsing simultaneously. Economic, ecological, political, technological, biological, psychological. Each system was a complex web of interactions that had defeated every previous attempt at holistic resolution. Most teams approached it like a mathematical problem. Calculate variables, minimize damage, predict outcomes. The human team saw something else entirely. As the holographic simulation materialized, the other teams deployed their most advanced predictive technologies. The Vornak unleashed genetic optimization algorithms that could simulate millions of potential interventions per microsecond. The Nexus 7 crystalline intelligence constructed probability matrices that would have impressed most galactic research institutions. Arya Chen closed her eyes. "We're not going to save the system," she said quietly. "We're going to understand it." Kai Rodriguez began his approach like an ecological restoration expert. Where others saw collapsing systems, he saw an interconnected living organism. His initial diagram looked less like a technical analysis and more like a living, breathing ecosystem map. Dr. Imani O'Keefe approached the simulation with a quantum physicist's radical perspective. She wasn't looking for linear solutions. She was mapping the quantum entanglements that held the entire system together, and were now pulling it apart. Marcus Green started tracking the human stories behind the collapsing systems, not as data points, but as living narratives. Each economic breakdown became a human struggle. Each ecological collapse told a story of collective trauma and resilience. Lena Wong began mapping the communication breakdown that was accelerating the systemic collapse. But she wasn't just tracking information flow. She was understanding the emotional landscapes that transformed communication into conflict. The consortium observers watched in bewilderment. Where other teams saw a problem to be solved, the humans saw a living system to be understood. 12 minutes into the challenge, most teams were still running initial predictive models. The human team had already begun to see the systemic collapse as a complex narrative of interconnected human experiences. Kai's ecological mapping revealed something extraordinary. The collapsing systems weren't just failing. They were in a state of profound transformation. Each breakdown was simultaneously a destruction and a potential rebirth. Dr. O'Keefe's quantum analysis showed that the systemic collapse wasn't a linear progression. It was a quantum state of possibility, where every potential failure contained the seeds of unprecedented innovation. Marcus discovered the human stories of resilience hidden within the statistical models. Each data point became a lived experience, each number a narrative of human potential. Lena's communication analysis revealed that the systemic breakdown was, at its core, a failure of collective imagination. Area watched, her mind creating connections that defied traditional computational thinking. The Karzen telepathic representative felt something unprecedented. The human team wasn't trying to control the system. They were creating a space of understanding so profound it could transform the very nature of systemic collapse. By the 20-minute mark, something extraordinary began to happen. The simulation didn't just stabilize. It began to evolve. Where other teams saw a problem to be solved, the humans had created a living framework of potential transformation. Economic systems that were collapsing began to show signs of radical reimagining. Ecological destruction revealed pathways of regenerative innovation. Political systems in free fall started to demonstrate unprecedented collaborative potential. The other teams watched in stunned silence. Their sophisticated models predicted total systemic failure. The human team had discovered a way to transform failure into possibility. Systems don't collapse, Area said softly. They transform. Kai's ecological mapping showed how each seemingly destructive element contained the potential for regeneration. Dr. O'Keefe's quantum analysis revealed transformation points that no previous model had ever detected. Marcus's human narratives demonstrated resilience beyond statistical prediction. Lena's communication framework showed how collective understanding could reshape entire societal structures. When the challenge concluded, the simulation looked fundamentally different. It wasn't just saved, it had been reimagined. The other teams had static models of prevention. The human team had created a living document of transformation. Survival, Area said, looking at the transformed holographic simulation, isn't about maintaining the current system. It's about creating the conditions for new possibilities. The consortium judges exchanged looks of profound discomfort and even more profound fascination. The systemic collapse simulation was complete, and the very understanding of societal resilience had just been rewritten. The creativity crucible was designed to be the ultimate test of innovative potential. No technological aids, no computational support, just pure, unfiltered creativity in its rawest form. Previous teams had approached the challenge with structured methodologies, sophisticated ideation frameworks, and carefully constructed problem-solving algorithms. They arrived with neural enhancement suits, collaborative thinking modules, and generations of refined innovative strategies. The human team arrived with something far more dangerous: curiosity, playfulness, an almost childlike willingness to explore. The challenge materialized as a blank space, infinite potential without a single defined parameter. Most teams froze, their highly specialized cognitive structures unable to process such open-ended possibility. Area Chen looked around with a smile that made the consortium observers deeply uncomfortable. "We're going to play," she announced. The other teams stared in confusion. Play. This was the most critical challenge of the entire competition, a test that had broken the most advanced, innovative minds in the galaxy, and the humans were going to play. Kai Rodriguez pulled out a collection of seemingly random objects: a piece of origami paper, a handful of colored markers, a small musical instrument that looked like a cross between a flute and something entirely alien. Dr. Imani O'Keefe began drawing geometric patterns that seemed to dance between mathematical precision and pure artistic expression. Her drawings weren't just visual, they seemed to vibrate with potential energy, each line a pathway to unexplored possibilities. Marcus Green started moving, not with any defined choreography, but with a series of movements that were part dance, part meditation, part pure exploration of physical potential. His body became a living laboratory of creativity, each gesture a question, each movement a potential solution. Lena Wong began creating a soundscape, not music in any traditional sense, but a living, breathing audio exploration that seemed to map the very edges of communication and creativity. The consortium observers watched in total bewilderment. Where other teams saw a challenge to be solved, the humans saw an invitation to explore. 12 minutes into the challenge, most teams were still constructing initial creative frameworks. The human team had already transformed the entire concept of creativity itself. K's random objects began to interact in ways that defied logical understanding. The origami paper became a three-dimensional map of potential innovation. The markers created connections that looked like living neural networks. The musical instrument became a tool for exploring cognitive boundaries. Dr. O'Keefe's geometric patterns began to pulse with quantum potential. Each line wasn't just a drawing. It was a living exploration of possibility. Mathematical precision transformed into pure creative potential. Marcus's movements became a language of innovation. Each gesture mapped unexplored cognitive territories. His body demonstrated that creativity wasn't about thinking. It was about experiencing, feeling, exploring. Lena's soundscape evolved into a complex communication system that existed between music, language, and pure emotional expression. She wasn't creating sound. She was mapping the very boundaries of communication itself. Arya watched, her mind creating connections that no computational model could predict. The Karzin telepathic representative felt something unprecedented. The human team wasn't just being creative. They were redefining the very nature of creativity itself. By the 20-minute mark, something extraordinary began to happen. The blank space of the challenge started to transform, not through any defined technological intervention, but through the pure, unfiltered potential of human exploration. The other teams watched in stunned silence. Their sophisticated creative frameworks predicted linear innovation. The human team had discovered a way to turn creativity into a living, breathing ecosystem of potential. Creativity, Arya said softly, isn't about finding the right answer. It's about creating new questions. K's objects had become a living map of innovation. Dr. O'Keefe's drawings pulsed with quantum potential. Marcus's movements described entire universes of possibility. Lena's soundscape had become a complex language of unexplored potential. When the challenge concluded, the blank space looked fundamentally different. It wasn't just filled with creative potential. It had been transformed into a living landscape of unexplored possibility. The other teams had static creative frameworks. The human team had created a living document of potential. Innovation, Arya said, looking at the transformed space, isn't about what you know. It's about what you're willing to not know. The consortium judges exchanged looks of profound discomfort and even more profound fascination. The creativity crucible was complete, and the very understanding of innovative potential had just been rewritten. The final convergence challenge was unlike anything in galactic scientific history. A comprehensive test that combined every previous challenge: linguistic complexity, social dynamics, technological innovation, psychological adaptation, and pure imaginative potential. It was designed to be the ultimate crucible, a test so complex that it had been known to shatter entire research teams. Most teams approached it with their most advanced technological arsenals: quantum computational matrices, telepathic resonance networks, genetic optimization algorithms that could simulate millions of potential scenarios per microsecond. The human team approached it like a collaborative game. As the challenge materialized, the entire evaluation chamber seemed to hold its breath. Holographic interfaces flickered with possibilities that defied traditional understanding. Quantum probability fields danced with potential outcomes. Arya Chen stood at the center, her team around her, not as individual competitors, but as a living, breathing ecosystem of potential. "We're not going to solve this," she said quietly. "We're going to explore it together." The consortium observers felt a collective shiver of anticipation. Kay Rodriguez began mapping the challenge's systemic interactions like an ecological designer. Where others saw a complex problem, he saw a living network of interconnected possibilities. His initial diagram looked less like a technical analysis and more like a living, breathing ecosystem, each connection a potential pathway of transformation. Dr. Imani O'Keefe approached the challenge with a quantum physicist's radical perspective. She wasn't looking for linear solutions. She was mapping the quantum entanglements that existed in the spaces between understanding. Her analysis created probability fields that seemed to pulse with living potential. Marcus Green tracked the human stories embedded within the challenge's complex parameters, not as data points, but as living narratives of potential and transformation. Each computational challenge became a story of human resilience. Each technological barrier became an invitation to reimagine possibility. Lina Wang began creating a communication framework that existed between language, emotion, and pure potential. She wasn't just translating. She was creating a living bridge of understanding that could connect seemingly incompatible systems of meaning. 12 minutes into the challenge, most teams were still constructing initial approach vectors. The human team had already begun to transform the very nature of the challenge itself. Kai's ecological mapping revealed extraordinary interconnections. The challenge wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a living system waiting to be understood. Each seemingly impossible barrier contained hidden pathways of potential transformation. Dr. O'Keefe's quantum analysis showed that the challenge existed in a state of perpetual possibility. Traditional computational models collapsed, replaced by a living framework of potential that defied linear understanding. Marcus discovered the human stories of resilience hidden within the most complex computational parameters. Each impossible scenario became an invitation to reimagine human potential. Lina's communication analysis transformed the challenge into a complex dialogue, not between competing systems, but between living, evolving potentials of understanding. Area watched, her mind creating connections that seemed to exist in the spaces between known and unknown. The Karzan telepathic representative felt something unprecedented. The human team wasn't trying to conquer the challenge. They were creating a space of understanding so profound it could transform the very nature of complex problem-solving. By the 20-minute mark, something extraordinary began to happen. The challenge didn't just become solvable. It became a living ecosystem of potential. Computational barriers dissolved. Linguistic complexities transformed into bridges of understanding. Technological challenges became invitations to reimagine possibility. The other teams watched in stunned silence. Their most sophisticated predictive models predicted total system failure. The human team had discovered a way to turn an impossible challenge into a landscape of transformation. Challenges, Area said softly, aren't obstacles. They're invitations. When the final phase concluded, the entire evaluation chamber had transformed. It wasn't just a test space anymore. It had become a living document of human potential. The other teams had static computational records. The human team had created a living framework of possibility. Potential, Area said, looking at the transformed space, isn't something you achieve. It's something you create together. The consortium judges exchanged looks of profound discomfort and even more profound fascination. The final convergence challenge was complete, and the very understanding of human potential had just been rewritten. In that moment, the galaxy would never be the same again. The aftermath was unlike anything in galactic history. The Galactic Scholarly Consortium had existed for 10,000 years. They had evaluated countless civilizations, measured intelligence across impossible dimensional boundaries, and constructed challenges that had broken the most advanced species in the known universe. They had never been so comprehensively transformed. The final evaluation chamber remained a living testament to the human team's approach. What had once been a sterile testing environment now pulsed with potential, a physical manifestation of the team's extraordinary way of understanding reality. Arch-researcher Vexnar, a being so ancient its original biological form was nothing more than a historical footnote, stood motionless. The computational matrices that had defined its existence for millennia were fundamentally shattered. Area Chen and her team stood together, not as competitors, but as a living ecosystem of potential. "We didn't win," she said quietly. "We discovered." The consortium's most advanced predictive models began to collapse, not through technological failure, but through a fundamental reimagining of what intelligence could mean. Kai Rodriguez's ecological mapping had transformed the entire understanding of systemic interaction. Where previous research saw isolated systems, he had demonstrated a holistic approach that revealed the profound interconnectedness of all complex networks. Dr. Imani O'Keefe's quantum analysis had shattered traditional computational thinking. Her work suggested that intelligence wasn't a fixed state, but a dynamic, evolving potential that existed in the spaces between known and unknown. Marcus Green's approach to human narratives had revealed that every challenge was fundamentally a story of potential transformation. Intelligence wasn't about solving problems. It was about creating new ways of understanding. Lina Wang's communication framework suggested that language itself was a living, breathing entity, not a tool of translation, but a bridge of collective understanding. Delegates from thousands of civilizations watched in stunned silence. The Karzin telepathic representatives found their entire conceptual framework fundamentally challenged. The human team hadn't just demonstrated intelligence, they had revealed an entirely new way of experiencing potential. The Vornak genetic optimization experts realized their approach to evolution had been catastrophically limited. Intelligence wasn't about perfecting a single path, but about creating multiple pathways of possibility. The Nexus 7 crystalline intelligence discovered that computation was merely a narrow window into a much broader landscape of understanding. Arya watched as the implications began to ripple across the gathered civilizations. "We're not special," she said, her voice carrying across the chamber. "We're just willing to be curious, to play, to see challenges as invitations rather than obstacles." The consortium's most senior researchers began to understand that they had been asking the wrong questions entirely. Intelligence wasn't something to be measured. It was something to be explored, not a destination, but a continuous journey of discovery. Vexnar approached the human team, its ancient computational matrix struggling to process what had occurred. How? The word emerged more as a quantum vibration than a spoken language. Arya smiled. "We remembered something most species forget. That the most powerful technology is imagination. That the most profound intelligence is curiosity." The chamber itself seemed to breathe with new potential. Kai's ecological mapping showed how every system was interconnected. Marcus's narrative approach revealed the human stories behind complex challenges. Dr. O'Keefe's quantum analysis demonstrated potential in the spaces between known understanding. Lena's communication frameworks created bridges where others saw only barriers. And Arya, she had shown that leadership wasn't about control, but about creating spaces where collective potential could emerge. The Galactic Scholarly Consortium would never be the same. Their entire framework of understanding intelligence had been fundamentally transformed. Thousands of civilizations watched as humanity was no longer seen as a young, emerging species. They were recognized as something far more profound. A civilization of potential, of imagination, of continuous discovery. "We don't have the most advanced technology," Arya said softly. "We have the most advanced imagination." In that moment, the galaxy shifted, not through conflict, not through technological superiority, but through a profound reimagining of what potential could mean. The challenge was complete, but the real journey was just beginning. Humanity had entered the galactic stage, not as conquerors, not as competitors, but as explorers of possibility. The universe would never be the same again.